Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of Bournemouth Christchurch and Poole Council's Audit and Governance Committee. Very warm welcome to members of the committee, to officers and members who may be online, and of course to members of the public. If I could ask Mr. Hampton from Democratic Services to run us through the procedure for the meeting, please. Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. Any councillors or officers not in the room and wishing to speak, please use the raise your hand feature and switch on your video when invited to speak by the Chairman. Please could members who are in the room only speak when invited by the Chairman and mute their microphones when not speaking. And finally, Chairman, please could members ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could now ask you, Mr. Hampton, if you could take us through items 1, 2 and 3 on the agenda, please.
Chairman, there's no apologies for tonight's meeting. Everyone is present and therefore no substitutes. And then moving on to item 3, Chairman, may I invite any members with decorations to say so?
There do not appear to be any. Moving then on to item 4 on the agenda, confirmation of minutes. The minutes for our last meeting held on the 13th of January 2022 have been circulated. Are you content that those are a true and accurate record of that meeting? Is that agreed? Thank you very much indeed, members. Thank you. Takes us to item 5 on the agenda, public issues. We have public issues from a member of the public, Mr. Philip Gattrell, and this will be taken in 3 parts. The first one is a question, and I'll ask Mr. Hampton to read the question to the meeting, and then the Council's monitoring officer, Susan Zeiss, will give the response. Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, Chairman. The first question. Question to BCP Council Audit and Governance Committee 13/1/22. Following my notifying emails commencing 25/7/21, including 39/21, copied to CEO, Monitoring Officer, brackets MO, close brackets, and Section 151 Officers and Leader, when will the Council resolve the following by, semicolon, 1. Complying with the local authorities' Members' Allowances England Regulations 2003 by publishing in the correct format and on the Council's direct search website portals the details of allowances paid to each member for 2019/20 and 2020/21. Full stop. The Council explains the cause of delay as a broken website link. Full stop. 2. Complying with the Local Government and Housing Act 1989 and issuing the MO's obligatory explanatory report to all members on this and other similar contraventions. Philip Gattrell, 5/1/22.
Thank you, Chair. I'll read out the response. Mr. Gattrell, thank you for your question. The Local Authorities Members' Allowances England Regulations 2003 require the Council to publish the total sum paid to each recipient under the scheme of members' allowances in respect of the basic, special responsibility, dependents, carers, travelling and subsistence and co-optees allowances. BCP Council publishes these notices on its website on the Councillor's web page. The current notices published on the site are for 2019-2020 and 2020-2021. The notice for 21-22 will be published on the same web page as soon as practically possible after the financial year end. Following the receipt of the question from Mr. Gattrell, officers identified a broken link on the Council's main website. This was clearly unhelpful for users. However, the notices continued to be available from the Councillor's webpage and were readily available on the website and at all times satisfied the requirements of the regulations. I would like to thank Mr. Gattrell for drawing our attention to the broken link, which was resolved on Friday, the 7th of January. The link from the Council's main website now directs visitors to the page containing the allowances notices. Section 5.2 of the Local Government and Housing Act 1989, to which Mr. Gattrell refers in the second part of his question, requires the monitoring officer to report to Council if at any time it appears to her that any proposal, decision, or omission on behalf of the authority has given rise or is likely to or would give rise to a contravention of any enactment or rule of law. A broken link on the Council's website, although frustrating, does not meet the criteria for such reporting. Thank you, Chair.
The second question from Mr. Gattrell, again, I will ask Mr. Hampton for Democratic Services to read out to members of the committee, and once he's done so, I'll ask Susan Zeiss, the Council's monitoring officer, to give the response. Mr. Hampton.
Second question. Regarding the Council's contravention of the Local Authorities Member Allowances England Regulations 2003, brackets 2003 regulations, close brackets, and the incorrect and misleading response to my question at the committee's meeting on 13/1/22, when it was stated that the Council's related website information at all times satisfied the requirements of the regulations. Will the monitoring officer, brackets MO, close brackets, explain and confirm as appropriate the following, where the evidenced irregularities below have been previously notified by me to the MO in writing, dash. Why the MO's response at the meeting on 13/1/22 failed to disclose the notified contravention of the statutory 2003 regulations, when it is manifest that the non-compliant format published online does not provide all of the necessary details for members' allowances paid in 2019/20 and 2020/21. Does the MO confirm that the notified material discrepancies in certain members' allowances payments will be corrected with timely republication online, together with any further adjustments? Philip Gattrell, 27 January 2022.
Ms. Zeiss.
Thank you, Chairman. I thank Mr. Gattrell again for his question. Mr. Gattrell has sent a significant number of emails in recent weeks raising numerous points, including both general matters of concern and specific allegations of inaccuracy. In order to assess these detailed allegations, it will be necessary to undertake a full reconciliation of each transaction of allowances paid to councillors since the 1st of April 2019. This task will require the allocation of resources, and it was not reasonably practicable to complete the work before this meeting. Mr. Gattrell has been advised that a detailed response will not be available until the necessary work has been completed by officers to enable the Council to respond as fully and accurately as possible. At that time, the Council's response will be sent to Mr. Gattrell and copied to the committee. Thank you, Chair.
And finally, Mr. Gattrell has a statement to make for the committee, which will be read out by Mr. Hampton from Democratic Services. Mr. Hampton.
Statement. Public statement for the BCP Audit and Governance Committee meeting on 3/2/22 regarding the Council's continuing contravention of the statutory local authorities, brackets members' allowances, close brackets, England regulations, brackets 2003 regulations, close brackets, as raised in this writer's question at the committee's previous meeting on 13/1/22. Statement. The monitoring officer's response on 13/1/22 noted that the appropriate website link for details of each member's annual allowances paid in 2019/20 and 2020/21 has been enabled. I have also been advised that the omission of the final two paragraphs from the verbal response, albeit incorrectly indicating compliance, will be reproduced in full written form by minuting on 3/2/22. Full stop. It is not clear whether the 3/2/22 meeting will disclose the continuing contravention of the 2003 regulations due to the incorrect published analysis of allowances paid and, similarly, material misstatements in certain amounts, as previously identified and notified by me. Philip Gattrell, 1/2/22.
That concludes item 5, public issues, and takes us on to item 6, which is the substantive reason for this evening's meeting. Just before I do, Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify some of the answers that the MO has just read out, because I was interested in what Mr. Gattrell was saying, and I did some research of my own, and I can't find where my allowances are. Maybe I'm technologically incompetent, but I'm actually on my page now, and I can't find where my allowances are. I went onto the main councillor's page, and I can't find where my allowances are. So, you know, I'm not entirely sure that that answer is correct. And even if it was correct, I do find that the issue of members' allowances is got nothing to do with materiality. It's actually it's a specific point which I think we should be getting absolutely spot on, and we should be making every effort to get right, because it is something that the general public, for whatever reason, are interested in, and therefore I think we should be making effort. Now, one thing I can very much appreciate at this particular time is the strain that the accounts department, the finance department are under, given the budget that is coming up. So I'm certainly prepared to accept that maybe a delay at the moment. But I do think this is an important issue that we should put at the top of our agenda to make sure that we are issuing accurate statements.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. I will refer to the monitoring officer in just a moment, although in her response she dealt specifically with that in terms of wanting sufficient time to enable resource to establish accurately and completely the information that the member of public was trying to ascertain. So I think that everybody is aligned in the perspective of what you have just stated, and I know from the response that the monitoring officer is doing her very best to ensure that's what occurs, but I won't speak for her. Ms Syce.
Thank you, Chairman. What I would say, Councillor Cox, is that the Head of Democratic Services and I have tested that link a number of times, so I wonder if we could take that offline with you and just see what might be happening, because we did get it fixed and we have tested it, so unless some glitches happened this evening. On the question of materiality, the materiality I mentioned in the answer of my first question about it not being sufficient criteria for unlawfulness for the link to have broken should not be translated into whether or not the information is correct, because that's going to be the subject of our forensic examination. And I wasn't applying materiality to that. That has to be correct under the regulations. We just need a bit more time to do that work, to make sure that all those checks have been done. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
So members, we'll now move on to item 6 on the agenda, which is the additional restriction grant known as ARG. Could I thank Councillor Phipps for bringing this issue to the committee in the first place, and I gave a response at the time confirming that we would look at the background to this, and we would then make sure that the committee got a presentation and an opportunity to answer questions around the distribution of ARG. We, of course, will only be sticking to the governance issues around that, because that's the extent of our remit. But I think that is what the essence of your question in the first place to me, Councillor Phipps, was anyway. So how we're going to do this is we're going to have a presentation, after which we have the Chief Executive and the Chief Financial Officer, who both want to add from their perspective how they've seen this working for BCP Council, and then once we've heard that, we will go to questions. I'd like to make that as seamless as possible so that our questions are properly informed before we ask any of them, and we'll see how we go from there once we get to that point in the meeting. So in terms of the presentation, the two officers dealing with the presentation itself will be, first of all, Chris Shepherd, the Director of Development Services, who will be, I think, giving us a short introduction. And he will then hand over to Adrian Trevitt, who's the Head of Economic Development, who will actually make the presentation to us. Over to you, Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, everybody. So, as the Chair's just rightly said, I'm Chris Shepherd, Director of Development at the Council, and I will be handing over to Adrian shortly, but I just really wanted to set out a bit of context. So, just cast your mind back to at least the beginning of the pandemic, and we just wanted to summarise what we've seen since then in terms of the values coming through government in terms of grants. So over £2 billion has been pumped into the BCP economy through furlough and other government initiatives. We are now over £200 million in grants awarded or dispersed. Economic development, as you'll hear later, were involved early on in not just sourcing PPE equipment and food for the vulnerable, but also liaising with our business community throughout the period. And a lot of that was about actually translating government's communications to us into a language that businesses could understand. We conducted thousands of business engagements, and the feedback was astonishingly good. And we have some really strong comments and quotes from our businesses to demonstrate their thanks. And we've been working really closely with Business Rates team who are experts in these schemes throughout. So I also wanted to state that whilst the additional restrictions grant is an important aspect and the focus of what we're talking about here tonight, it's not the only thing. And that's kind of what I'm trying to demonstrate here. It's a fraction of the overall economic landscape, but it is the bit that we can measure and the bit that which we are and will report on. But finally, before I pass over to Adrian, I just wanted to say again, and I have said publicly before, that my team have done a sterling job in unprecedented circumstances to facilitate and enable all of this, working with businesses to ensure the local economy not only survived, but could open up again effectively. As we'll hear shortly, this was done following the guidance provided from central government and in line with our own governance, sometimes going above and beyond. Thank you. I'll now pass over to Adrian.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Is that okay?
You can see it, Adrian.
Okay, perfect. Right, good evening. For those that don't know me, my name's Adrian Trevitt and I'm Head of Economic Development for BCP. And I'm going to give you a summary of the additional restrictions grant, the operational processes that we had, the governance, and also what's next. So the government announced the additional restrictions grant on 31st of October 2020, alongside a number of other things that were already going on, like Chris has already mentioned, furlough and business loans, VAT reductions, rate relief grants, etc. And the government department that released it, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS for short, although they said it was a discretionary grant, they did actually put some criteria down in terms of our scope and the applications from businesses. And also another thing that we found was that because the local authorities could use their discretion, local authorities handled ARG in different ways. So we had some national companies that were asking us questions about why weren't we doing the same as Sunderland, etc., which caused a number of questions. The businesses could be awarded either direct grants or funding could be allocated for business support activities. I think another point, which is the last one there, is that because of the pandemic and the express wishes of government to get the money out as quickly as possible, they were sending letters and emails to chief executives of local authorities to basically encourage them to get the money out as quickly as they possibly could, but also making sure that the appropriate due diligence was done. And sometimes, I think on about ARG 2 or 3, government started changing the timelines and the dates, and we did all that we could to fit in with those and to make sure that future money was coming. And I think last thing I'll say on this slide is overall there's about 6,000 ARG payments that have been made to businesses across BCP. Okay, so this slide is quite busy, so I'll just give you a summary of the ARG schemes, and then you can see on there all their different spend levels, whether it's business rates or economic development responsible, the types of application process, when we went to the various committees, checks, and the timeframes. So ARG Stream 1 was provided to businesses who are not subject to business rates, and they were mandated to close under national lockdowns, or they weren't mandated to close, but they were financially impacted by the closure of those businesses that were mandated to close. ARG Stream 2 was about direct business grants to local priority businesses that had been severely and financially impacted by the national restrictions. So examples of these are nightclubs, the events industry, aerospace, the travel industry, and language schools. And the grants range between 2.5 and 25,000. ARG Stream 3 I'll come on to on the next slide in some more detail, so I can show you exactly what was in ARG Stream 3. And then in ARG Stream 4, there's a whole plethora of businesses and sectors that we've been able to support. So I'll just quickly list some of them. It's hospitality and leisure, health and beauty, our priority sectors. We also put money into business mentoring, some young people, well-being, and also our town and district centres. Now, as well as those 4 schemes, we've also had some additional money come, which we've called the Omicron ARG top-up. It's about 650,000, and we're currently going through defining that scheme now. One of the other key things to remember is that government are saying basically that local authorities have to get this money out of the organisation by the end of March 2022. Okay. So ARG Stream 3. So we had 5 schemes in this. The first one was around exceptional circumstances, and we had 445 awards amounting to 871,000. This was a really important one because what we tried to do with our kind of overview of all the grants that were going out, we were trying to find the businesses that hadn't really got any support so far. So there was a number, 445 businesses had not had support already, and this exceptional circumstance was really for them. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been working really closely with our businesses and other institutions. We call it our R-Cubed programme. And within that, we've got 3 key programmes. One was retail, hospitality and leisure. One is welfare, and one is business. And that money was given to those groups to plan out how, from their perspective, could they help the respective scopes that they were looking at. Because we also put money towards the business improvement district, so Bournemouth Town Centre, Coastal and Poole. Christchurch didn't exist at that point, so they didn't get it at that point. Then we also awarded our business support partners. They were having issues in terms of membership renewals and struggling with income. So they also benefited from ARG Stream 3. Examples of those organisations were the Dorset Chamber and Silicon South. And one of the key things that I should say is that for each of these awards, apart from the exceptional circumstances, they had to apply to us. And when I come on to the operational process and the governance, you'll see that. So then we looked at, when we looked at the awards that we've made so far, we looked at coming up with a scheme where we were kind of asking the businesses to think about what are the things that they can do and what they think they need to do to actually bounce back from the pandemic. So we had 2 levels of award. One was at 15,000, one was at 70,000. And the 70,000 level required a lot more information, and also there was a lot more requirements on them to report to us in terms of their progress. All the applications that came in were based and assessed on 4 key criteria. One was pride in place, one was economy, one was innovation, and one was around deliverability. And all of them were scored against a matrix, which was actually available to all the applicants so they could see the criteria that we were looking for within their bids. I think within another key point around this scheme was, though, that it was a really competitive scheme and it was really well subscribed. So we had over 320 applications with a value of about just under £11 million. And we actually awarded 109 projects with a value of about 3.1 million. So because it was a competitive process, we did not allow an appeal. Earlier, things like the Exceptional Circumstances Fund, we did allow ongoing liaison with the applicants because we needed information like bank statements and invoices to prove that they were who they said they were and they were fit to receive that funding. But in a competitive process, that wasn't appropriate. In terms of the scoring, we had 3 different gateways for the Bounce Back Challenge Fund, which I'll come on to. And like I said, we've also done a lot of monitoring of the applications and the work that the businesses have been doing for this fund. But I'm kind of holding back a bit of the information because some of this is covered in the next slide. So this is the operational process that we went through to do the Bounce Back Challenge Fund. So the scheme had been based on all guidance from government, our local knowledge, and one of the things that we've kind of learned and kind of taken on board is that for a lot of the business rates team schemes, they use a company called ACS. And ACS are a leading consultancy, and they provide consultancy to local government and central government, and their specialisms are in finance, local taxation and welfare benefits. And they're supporting over 250 local authorities and government departments. So we tested the scheme with ACS to make sure that it was in line with BEIS regulations, which we also kind of had a good idea about. Then we, once the scheme was agreed and approved through either CIMT or CMB, with delegated authority to the Director of Economic Development, we then started to advertise our schemes. So we would put them on the council's website, we put them in newsletter, we'd work with comms to do campaigns, and we also used our own networks. When companies come in and they made their submissions, we use something called the National Fraud Initiative, NFI, and checked every single organisation that come in. The NFI check, which is recommended by government, checks basically the applicant's bank accounts, make sure there's nothing untoward going on there, and also that the company was active. We asked our business support partner, the Dorset Growth Hub, to undertake a check of the applications for a number of reasons. But mainly it was because of the volume we needed to, we wanted to move quickly, then we kind of used them to do the initial scoring. However, it was important that we actually double checked and went through that scoring, as we're the ultimate decision makers here, and we wouldn't be able to just say, well, DGH scored them. We had to make sure that we understood and validated those decisions. Then we took all the successful awards to the award panel to get verified, where they were discussed, and they were, in fact, the award panel received an overview of each of the applications, and if there were any changes, they were all discussed and verified, and ultimately the Director of Development agreed them. Award letters were then sent out and payment made following receipt of the signed letter. Refusal letters were also sent out and highlight the fact that there was no right of appeal. And I think there's a few things here now about the ongoing monitoring and evidence gathering. So we are monitoring every single one of the Bounce Back Challenge Fund projects. We've asked for interim reports for the larger applications and final reports from every applicant. And we're capturing things like, how many jobs have they created, how many jobs have they protected, and what's the overall value to the local economy. All the time we're doing this, government are continually pushing us to get the money out there and incentivizing that through more kind of potential funding in further rounds of ARG. I think because it's a discretionary fund, government and MPs are advising people to access or speak to local authorities because we have that discretionary funding. So we received a lot of calls from various different associations like the Cattery Association and a number of others saying, where's our money? And we had to spend a lot of time explaining to people why we were doing what we were doing. Okay, so that was really the what's my cursor? So in terms of the governance, I think some of this I've kind of been through in the last slide, but I'll just go through this for completeness. We talked about the consultant from ACS who basically took ownership of the scheme. So the scheme document, we always agreed with him and we published it on the website, and it reflected what had been agreed at CIMT or CMB, depending on which stage of the pandemic we were on. In the early stages of our ARG, we did prepayment assurance, but from ARG1 onwards, we had the NFI checks. Again, we are keeping those, doing those reports and getting the reports from the businesses. We've also had an internal audit, and the result from the audit was reasonable assurance. We had 2 medium and 5 low risks. And we are starting to address those issues as we're going through the process. There's another big step that will come for us probably later in the year, and we don't know when yet, but BEIS will actually come back in and audit us and make sure that we've been doing things appropriately, correctly. So next steps, as I said, BEIS audit. The monitoring reports, so we're expecting all of those applicants to keep telling us how they're getting on, and we're more than happy to come back after March to give an update on how all of those projects have performed. And we're also going to be looking at providing a summary of the whole of ARG and what its impact's been on the local economy, specifically around Bounce Back Challenge Fund. So I hope you found this presentation useful in terms of understanding the operations and governance they had in place with ARG, and I'd like to thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trevett. I believe you're going to distribute the slides to members of the committee. Could you just indicate when that's going to be, please?
Yeah, I can send. I'll send them tomorrow. I can send them to Bob tomorrow.
That would be very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So if I could now ask the Chief Executive, Graham Farrant, I think you wanted to add to the presentation from your perspective from dealing with government. Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, just a small statement, really, just to reflect on the overall pressure on the teams that have been doing this work, because I think Adrian's presentation really showed the ARG process, didn't show the entire grant and business support process that we've been through in the last 2 years since COVID started. And I have to say, with all due respect to him, he made it look very smooth and planned, which is good for him and the team, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the reality and the way that people felt and the way that government was working at the time. So I just really want to emphasise that and pay tribute to the work of that team, but also the supporting teams in finance in particular have been under incredible pressure. So just worth saying that most schemes have been announced by government before they knew what the rules or the constraints were. So government minister would announce the scheme, we would immediately start getting contact from businesses asking how to apply, how to get the money, well before we had any idea of what the rules were, what the constraints might be. And therefore we found ourselves in many cases not being able to tell businesses that turned out in the end not to be eligible, that they weren't eligible at the start. So that was a real difficulty for us. And actually just going back to the beginning of the business support grants, BEIS have put everybody under incredible pressure to get the money out there, because of course, once the government has decided to spend the money is better placed where it needs to be, which is in the hands of local businesses and not necessarily in the hands of government. But that did mean in the very first allocation we got for business support, which I'm sure Adam Richards can correct me, it was something like £120 million, but it included a £30 million effectively overpayment for us to distribute. We spotted that, said that we didn't think government intended us to distribute the lot. And eventually, of course, the government said, no, you're quite right, we didn't. But what that meant was from day one, we thought we could only spend £90 million, and that was right. But we were being monitored against a £120 million target. So it looked like BCP Council was under delivering in terms of getting the money out to the businesses, but in reality, we weren't. Government's response to that was that Bays would put in incredible pressure on, and just to be really clear about that, a couple of times I've had messages saying the minister is going to phone you, Graham, to talk about the allocation of grants. I have to say on no occasion has the minister phoned me directly, but they made it clear the minister had my mobile phone number, and if they felt that we were underperforming, then we would get a phone call for me to explain why we were underperforming. So that's the sort of pressure that the organisation has been under. And I think, as I say, I think Adrian's presentation perhaps didn't bring that out, because it's quite right that he doesn't, but I think it is right that I illustrate the type of pressure that the organisation has been under. And I think some of the lessons that we've learned, for example, discretion generally is a good thing. It allows us to flavour the grant regimes to our local economy and to look at the unique characteristics of the BCP economy. The problem with that is it does mean there is difference and inconsistency in the way those grants are handled between local authorities. And then agencies that work across local authorities will spot that difference, and they'll see it and they'll question it and they'll challenge it. And many people will say, well, I've heard that Dorset Council are doing this, why are you doing something different? Or Wiltshire Council or North Yorkshire Council or whichever council it is. So I think it's right to give discretion. The problem is that makes it much more difficult for us, because we have to be really clear then about what the control measures are. So I just wanted to make that statement, because I think that might be helpful in terms of putting all of the ARG contexts and other grants, ARG and other support into the context of what was a very rapidly changing environment. Bearing in mind we were doing this working remotely for the first time, we were trying to do it using emergency decision making through corporate incident management team. So I just wanted really to give a bit of that flavour. But I think Adam Richards then wanted to perhaps come in with a bit more detail, but I hope that's helpful to the committee.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Farrant. It is very helpful, and that additional background, I think, gives us a greater degree of context than perhaps we would have got just from the presentation. So if I could now go to Adam Richards, the Council's Chief Financial Officer. Mr. Richards.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I'd be grateful if you can indulge me for a few moments to maybe elaborate on some of the statements that are made by Chris and from Graham. Can I emphasise that I would hate for any discussion tonight to detract from the absolutely incredible and enormous efforts that the staff within the Council's Revenue and Benefits and Economic Development teams have made since the start of this pandemic. They have made 4,596 small business grant funds payments that were worth £46 million. They made 1,652 retail, hospitality and leisure business grant fund payments worth £33.7 million. They made 794 local authority discretionary grant fund payments worth £4.3 million. They made 12,853 local restriction support grant closed addendum payments worth £22.7 million. They made 24 local restriction support grant sector payments worth £17.7 million. They made 41 local restriction support grant closed payments worth £76.6 million. They made 564 local restriction support grant open payments worth £776,000. They made 93 Christmas support payments for wet-led pubs worth £93,000. They made 3,278 closed business lockdown payments worth £16.3 million. They made 5,988 additional restriction support grant payments worth £12.6 million. They made 3,256 restart grant payments worth £24.3 million. They are in the process of making Omicron hospitality and leisure grants, with the first batch worth over £1 million due to be issued tomorrow. In addition, they had to arrange, manage and deliver 100% expanded retail relief for 2020-21. They had to arrange, manage and deliver 100% nursery discount relief for 2021, 100% for 3 months and then 66% extended retail relief for 2021-2, 100% for 3 months and then 66% for nursery discounts for 21-22. They had to do process and manage and arrange for COVID additional relief fund for 21-22, a 50% expanded retail relief for 22-23, and the extension of the transitional relief and supporting small business relief for small and medium-sized properties in 2022-23. In addition, they had to arrange, manage and deliver 4,548 to date £500 test and trace payments worth over £2.3 million. And in addition, they also had to process the COVID-19 Hardship Fund for 2021, which provided £2.5 million support towards council tax bills. And today we have received the indication that the team will need to administer a £150 rebate on council tax bills for all homes in bands A to D, as well as processing a share of £150 million National Discretionary Fund to help lower income households in higher council tax bands and households in bands A to D who are exempt from council tax during 22-23. I would also request that it be acknowledged that all this extra work was undertaken at short notice, with guidance that took time to come forward from government, with guidance that was often changing, and the staff, just like the population as a whole, had to perform these roles while getting used to home working, coping with homeschooling of children, coping with the tragic impact of COVID-19, and while even having COVID-19 themselves. Personally, from the beginning, I emphasised to government my concern about discretionary schemes. Many of our businesses, as has already been said, operate nationally, and they were confused if they could get a grant in Peterborough, Stoke, Newcastle, or Liverpool, but not in BCP, or probably vice versa. Often they would complain to the officer, and having had a response, they would then escalate their response to the chief executive, the ward councillor, the portfolio holder, the leader, the MP, all of whom would then forward the complaint back to the service and just add to the volume of work that they actually had to deal with. I hope what I said is seen as helpful context to your discussion tonight.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Richards. And before we get into questions and answers from officers, could I convey on behalf of the committee our gratitude to the huge volume of work undertaken by you and your team, which is all in addition to normal business. I think it is appreciated that the issues that then raises are very, very substantial. And I don't think we would in any way want to mitigate that because we can only be full of admiration about how much work has been undertaken by relatively few people at very short notice. The purpose of this evening is very much around audit and governance, understanding the background, focusing strictly on the governance issues, and I'm going to have to be strict about that because otherwise we'll be exceeding our remit, and we must not do that, nor should we even think of it. And also, having spoken with the monitoring officer, we don't want to get down to individual cases. We're focused very much on the generality of the governance arrangements that have been put in place and have been undertaken, but that needs us to see it in the context of the way the government have actually delegated this work to the local authority and the way the local authority have discharged that undertaking. So if we can try to make sure we stay true to those principles, I think that would help us enormously. But a very high degree of gratitude and admiration, I must say, for the work that's been undertaken by both the economic development team and the finance team in bringing this forward and getting it towards a conclusion. So, members, I will now take questions. I wonder whether those questions should commence with Councillor Phipps, who first brought the issue to our attention. And if not a question, Councillor Phipps, perhaps a general observation of what we've heard this evening. Is it, in your view, fit for the purpose of this committee in undertaking those obligations? And are you satisfied that we're on the right track here? Councillor Phipps.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, I'll start by saying, of course, we appreciate the great efforts, and obviously, as we've just heard, have been a lot of efforts put into all of this. And I am sure many businesses across the area have benefited from this scheme. I'm absolutely sure that they have. As far as I'm aware, the scheme was put forward, or the schemes, the ARG was put forward for those businesses which were affected by COVID. And the main objective, I believe, was for protecting jobs and keeping those businesses running. And I'm sure that has worked in a lot of ways with a lot of businesses. And I don't detract from the work and the effort and the good things that have come out of this at all. However, I do think that there are quite a lot of anomalies that have occurred here within this scheme. And certainly from the public perception, as far as I'm concerned, I even had a phone call today about something someone was not happy about. There are issues that I think we probably need to ask questions about. I appreciate you want to do this in a general way, but that may mean that we have to refer to not specific companies, but examples, should I say, of what has occurred in various grants that may have come forward or the way the scheme has been managed. Is that okay for a start?
Yes, I think, Councillor Phipps, in terms of my introduction, by all means, if there are broader examples, that is fine. I think if they are specific to an application or a particular grant for a particular business, then that's something that should quite properly be taken up outside of the meeting. And I'm sure that outside of this meeting, officers will be alive to the fact that one or two members may wish to do that. And that's quite proper that they should. I wouldn't want to be airing those specific ones though in public, because I don't think that would be appropriate. So did you want to add to that, or were you looking for a general response to start us off?
No, I'm happy to go for a general start with a question, if you like. I don't want to add to what I've said unless anyone else wants to come in generally to start with. Right,
okay, thank you very much. Which of our officer team would like to respond to Councillor Phipps? I only have 2 of you up on the screen instead of 4, so that limits the options. I wonder, Mr. Shepherd, would you like to start?
I would, but it'd be good if I could understand a bit more about the question on the point. I think I understood that she suggested there were anomalies in the process, and I think Adrian's presentation cleared up that the way we went about that. So, did I miss a question in there? Apologies if I did.
No, but I was trying to draw out you in the way that you have now responded exactly that point. So, Councillor Phipps, would you like to proceed?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, some anomalies. You'll know one of them for a start. So I'll just go straight to that one to start with, and then I do have others because it's not just a single issue. And I think that's why we're here tonight, to talk about these things. So that's what I'm going to do. So there were changes in scores that came from the Dorset Growth Hub. They were actually employed to do a job, and then some scores were changed. The first one, and it was referred to in Mr. Stannard's report that came to this committee in November. It wasn't named, of course, but it is in there, and it's quite specific that a deliverability score was changed from a project actually being delivered, where it had a deliverability score of 0 for being delivered, to delivering a planning application, and it was given a score of 5, which upped it to get £70,000. Fine. I have since found out via correspondence with officers, which is what you've asked us to do, and I have done that. I've done that in the first instance, that actually I was told incorrectly that that deliverability score had been put up to 5 for a planning application to be delivered by the due date of the end of March, and it was only for stage 1 planning to deliver a few reports, certain reports, and tell you what they are, feasibility studies, landscaping studies, and that type of thing. So actually, that money, which is £70,000, which I believe could have gone to a business that actually exists, whereas this business doesn't exist in the location where the money was being given for, could have gone to the 70,000 in quite a few 15,000 to say 4 or whatever businesses, to businesses that really, really needed that money. So that's the first one. Now, there are other anomalies as well. So that's just a start. There's another company with assets shown of having £4.4 million of assets, and it was awarded £70,000, and its score was increased from 9 to 16. Now, if a company's got that amount of money, they don't necessarily need £70,000, and I do wonder how that sort of thing comes about. How does that happen within the governance of this scheme? Another company was awarded £15,000 for staff training, just to upskill people and to increase, so they were better at leading, managing, and being mentors. But they had £200,000 in the bank. How does that work? This sort of thing. I'd also like to come into bids as well. They're not actually individual businesses, whereas the government criteria, that is, not the BCP criteria, actually states that that it should be for businesses and that are considered trading and engaged in business activity. Now, bids aren't actually engaged in business activity themselves. So how did they come into the scheme of things? It seems we had the government guidance and then we had the BCP guidance, which was different or was changed. And did that go through a cabinet or did it go through council? I don't remember that happening. It seems that there's an anomaly between the BCP guidance and the government guidance. I know there's a lot of questions here, and I'll finish in a minute. But I just want to give you a context of where I'm coming from on this, that some of it just doesn't seem quite right. There were also a couple of grants given to a company that is actually part of the Dorset Growth Hub, and that, as public perception, doesn't look good. Whereas there were other small businesses that I know of, and you will know of, because you have been contacted about them, and I'm aware of it. And I know a ward councillor is on the call this evening, that actually got nothing. And they're actually trading, and they were really in dire straits, but they were turned down. And also, I've been contacted today, as it happens, just out of the blue, by a language school. And I think they saw something in the Echo or something. I haven't read the Echo, but there's something in there today. And so they just phoned me up to say that there wasn't a single language school, although they're on the list in the government criteria, that got a grant at all from Bounce Back or from this scheme. But what they did get was some sort of sector grant for the whole sector instead. But it didn't do anything for them at all because there were so many restrictions on it that all they've been able to do is upgrade their website. They've got a wonderful website now, so it's marvellous. But it didn't actually help them at all. And they feel really, really hard done by. And that's just a start. I think I'd better stop there because that's quite a lot, and I've got more. But I'm not at all trying to detract from what you've done. I'm sure a lot of businesses have done very well or been very grateful for the assistance that they've received. And it's obviously a lot of hard work that's gone in. But there are certain issues here that I think just, to my mind, aren't quite right or need explanation. Thank you.
So from a governance perspective, Mr. Shepherd, I think what Councillor Phipps is asking is how the interpretation of government guidance, albeit often at short notice, often changed and so forth, as we've heard, comes to the decision-making process about who gets what, if anything. And I think that goes to the heart of all of the issues that Councillor Phipps has raised. So that is also, though, at the heart of governance in terms of that decision-making process. So would you like to help start us off in the general terms against the issues that Councillor Phipps has raised, please?
Michelle, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Phipps, for your questions. I'll do my best, and I'm sure I'll be ably supported by Adrian with the detail in a second. I think trying to break this into chunks so that we can answer this clearly. And from memory, we'll need to make sure we list all these clearly. But I think in terms of the decision-making process we talked about, that there was no discrepancy between the central government guidance and the BCP guidance, as you put it, Councillor Phipps. It was one and the same thing. We, as Adrian outlined before, and as Graham also outlined, we were required to create a discretionary scheme, which we got tested and approved, and then approved through CIMT, because we needed to take those emergency powers in the time of the pandemic. That scheme was approved. As Adrian's pointed out, it was a particularly the bounce back challenge grants, which is what you're referring to, was a competitive scheme and was oversubscribed. The final decision for those grant awards rested with me, as per the delegation in the CIMT report, but I was advised by my colleagues in economic development as to the knowledge of the place that they have over and above the knowledge that the Growth Hub has. The Growth Hub were employed to do a job, as Adrian said, to take the capacity from us to score them to the best of their ability. But they don't have the inner workings of the council. They're our business support partner, but they only know so much. The wider economy is the professional job of Adrian and his team to understand and know to the best and the fullest. And with that advice, they were able to advise me on the appropriate scoring of all the applications, not just the ones that Councillor Phipps mentioned. So the other point I'd like to make is that we may well have opinions about whether people should or shouldn't have got funding, but we clearly laid out the criteria on the webpage and through our communications about what we were looking for people's applications. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough money in the pot to pay for everyone to have that grant. We had to run this competitive process, and this competitive process was about, if you remember at the time, coming out of a pandemic in theory at the beginning of 2021, to make 2021 a fantastic year for bouncing back from the pandemic, for it to be open again, for it to be fabulous. It wasn't, we covered off all the businesses that needed that grant in hardship through the funds Adrian mentioned. The Bounce Back Challenge was an opportunity to celebrate and to get businesses to come to us with their ideas about things they wanted to do to invest in growing their business. It was additional and extra. So there are plenty of examples, and some of the ones I know that Councillor Phipps is talking about have actually had grants through those processes. So there shouldn't be anybody without a grant, or at least without the opportunity to have applied for one. I think the final point I'd make from the questions I can remember that you asked, Councillor Phipps, was about language schools. You do not know the amount of hours that me and the team have put in working with the language school community to make sure that their issues were addressed and awarded sensible funding. They are a significant part of our economy, huge, both in terms of their in economy delivery, but also the voice to the world about our amazing place. The fact that they were not able to claim business rates relief through a government scheme was part of the problem they had, which has nothing to do with us. But we were working with them hand in glove to make sure that they had the funding they needed, and we were working with the forum, which represents all language schools, to make sure that they had an equitable solution. So I understand some schools might not have felt that to be the right answer for them, but this was the best way we could do it, again, with our discretion in the way we had to do it, in the time and the pressure we found ourselves under. So hopefully that answers some of those questions, but ultimately, I still feel that we made the right decisions through the delegated decision process in line with the governance. Adrian, I don't know if you want to say anything else, but I know Adam's got his hand up. You're on mute, Adrian.
Chair.
It was going so well. Sorry. Do you want me to respond, Chair?
Yes, if I could go back to Mr. Richards.
Okay.
Sorry,
I was just going to say a couple of things. I think we have to put into perspective how many of the scores were changed and then what we did with them. So a very, very small percentage of the scores were changed either above the qualifier mark or below the qualifier mark. But every single one that we changed, when we went to the award panel, we actually went through the justification as to why that we had changed that score. And that was subject then to a discussion at the award panel. And then ultimately, Chris had the decision to make. So it wasn't just the kind of, oh yeah, let's change that one. It was actually part of a process to understand why the score had changed. And I think the only other thing I would have said on the language schools is that the language schools sector within BCP has probably received the most funding in terms of grants from our process, and they have got significant amounts of funding through ARG and other activities as well. So they have been really, really well supported. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Trevitt. Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chair. And I just suppose I just wanted to make a point in the sense that there were many discretionary grant schemes in this whole process from the start of the pandemic up until and including the ARG. In those early discretionary schemes, I remember working with the Revenue and Benefits team and Vicky Slade as the leader at the council at the time, having the painful job of drawing the line somewhere. And there were always people that were the wrong side of that line. And I think, as I emphasised earlier, clearly, that meant that some firms and businesses that, ideally we would have supported, if we could, that we were unable to support, and clearly that they were disappointed. So I think it's been a consistent feature, not just of the ARG, but some of those, early discretionary grant schemes as well.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. What I would like to ask you is, would it be possible to distribute the many statistics that you gave us at the beginning of your earlier presentation in terms of the numbers of grants distributed and the quantum of them? Because for me, certainly, and I'm sure for others, that would give a much deeper context to the size of this undertaking, which, for most of our aspects, I'm sure we had no idea of the quantum in the first place. But if you could do that, it would be appreciated, please.
Chair, can I suggest that I send it to the Democratic person from Democratic Services so that they can include it in the minutes? Would that be helpful?
Yes, it would. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you. I will come back to you, Councillor Phipps. What I'd like to do, if we can, is to give the opportunity to other members of the committee. And I appreciate that there is a member present who is not on the committee. There's also one waiting online who asked me if he could ask questions, to which I said yes. But I'd like to deal with members of the committee first, if that's all right, and then may I come back to you after that? Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. It's a principle, really, I think. Here, I'm looking through the guidelines for the distribution of the funding and some of the rules and regulations, and in that, on point 43.0 is a heading reviews of decisions. It would be interesting to know, because clearly there was a huge quantity of grants given out. Inevitably there will be some disgruntled businesses, and equally there may be some mistakes that have been made. And this section deals with reviews, only 3 points, and it says the council will operate an internal review process and will accept an applicant's request for a review of its decisions. I have been made aware that an applicant did actually ask for a review and was told that he couldn't have a review because they weren't doing reviews, and that information should not have gone out. So how is it and this is where the principle comes in with process, what are we doing? Sending guidelines out that are not being followed, and people are being told that they shouldn't have been there. It gives me a lot of concerns over a whole lot of other processes, perhaps. But that in particular, I think, is a significant one, that you're sending out that, yes, you can do this, and when it's done, no, you can't, you shouldn't have done it. So is there an answer to that, please?
Is that for you, Mr. Trevitt, or for you, Mr. Shepherd?
Do you want me to go?
I'd be happy if Adrian answers that, Chair, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think when we were reviewing the scheme document, then basically what had happened was that the review statement was left in the document, and for the Bounce Back Challenge Fund, it was a mistake. However, what we did do and what we made sure was that when the refusal letter went out to the unsuccessful party, they were told in there that there was no right of appeal or no right for a review. So there were some things like the exceptional circumstances fund, for example, where a business could apply for the funding. They needed to provide us with 3 or 4 sets of information. And if we didn't get all of that information, we couldn't progress the bid. But through a review, we could get the information that we needed to allow the bid to actually be successful. But when we had the competitive element in Bounce Back Challenge Fund, it wasn't appropriate to do a review, because otherwise everyone that was unsuccessful would have come back. Everyone that was unsuccessful would have come back, and it would have kept coming back. And in the end, we would have ended up, potentially allocating £11 million, which was the amount of applications that had come in when we had a budget of 3 million. So in the competitive process, we did not have a review. But we did make a mistake with the documentation in the scheme documentation.
Would you like to come back, Councillor Brooks?
If I may, Chair, I understand what you're saying, but I still find it absolutely incredible that you have 2 different processes going on there. You just explained 2 different approaches, and yet a common set of guidelines is going out, and then you're turning around and saying, well, that isn't applicable to one of the 2 processes. You should have had 2 separate sets of guidelines that are appropriate for each of the processes, and then everyone would have known at the beginning where they were. What damage does it do to the reputation of this council to send something out that is wrong, and people operate in good faith on the instructions and the guidelines, and then are told that they can't because it's wrong? I know there's an awful lot of work gone on, and I appreciate that, but I find the fact that we are basing here now a scheme on incorrect information and instructions for the applicants is unacceptable, and lessons really must have to be learnt.
Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add to Adrian's words there that we made it quite clear that it was a competitive process from the beginning. We clearly outlined the criteria people needed to meet, and as Adrian said, this was oversubscribed. So I absolutely accept what Councillor Brooks is saying, and as you see, we've accepted that this was an error. But I think we just have to keep it in the context of what this was here. Forgive me, I was going to make another point. It will come back to me, no doubt, when I turn my microphone off. But I just really wanted to echo what Adrian was saying there, and thank you.
Councillor Filer.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to ask a couple of questions. The first one is of the figures, which I think Adrian spoke about the payments. He said one was 70,000 and one was it 15,000 or 50,000? And was it 70 or 17? It was quite quick.
It was 1515 and 7070.
Thank you very much. So we heard from Councillor Phipps that there were a number of very small companies that got nothing and were very disappointed, and that there were 1 or 2 companies who were more than solvent who got quite a lot. And for those very small companies who were sort of teetering on the brink anyway, 15,000 would have been a large amount of money, and it might have enabled them to carry on, or at least have the comfort of knowing that they could carry on for a while. This was all very sudden, and I appreciate how difficult it must have been for all of you to get to grips with such a huge thing so quickly, especially when we were all facing the anguish of being locked down. But my questions really are, how could you, it's a huge disparity between 70,000 and 15,000. How was it decided who got the very huge amount of money, and who might have been, would it have benefited more companies to get the lesser amount of money? That's one question. And how was it that Councillor Phipps mentioned a company that really wasn't in existence who got money, whereas people who were in existence and were really struggling didn't? I understand the element of competition, but it's sort of not like sending in a raffle ticket for a holiday in Thailand. I mean, this was really life or death for some businesses. And the other question I've got was who sat on this award panel membership committee? Who sat on that, and was there any member involvement on that panel?
So there are three questions there from Councillor Filer. I wonder whether perhaps Mr. Shepherd, you could start off on those, and then if you need to ask Mr. Trevitt to come back to us with any of the detail, I think that's probably the right order in which to deal with them. Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Filer. So I'll take the last one first because my memory is working that way. Apologies. So we the award panel was myself, grandly titled, supported by officers Adrian and Matt, his colleague, and Councillor Broadhead was present as a consultee. The amounts I think you've asked about, again, I kind of want to make the point again that Bounce Back Challenge was an additional fund, part of ARG3. Many businesses had already received grants, either statutorily or through the discretionary amounts. So it wasn't as if businesses didn't get anything. Businesses had previously had opportunities and should have had funding. So this was about businesses coming to us with their ideas for additional funding, as opposed to handing out for, as you sort of suggested, where people were still not able to trade or in worse situations. The values of the amounts I'd need to defer to Adrian for, but I think from memory, I think we scheduled them so that we had to obviously work with the amount of money we had available. So we needed to cut that in a way that made sense, and we knew we had, we felt from our knowledge of the economy that we felt that there would be businesses that would benefit at a larger scale, that would really be able to do some really excellent stuff with that funding. And as you say, quite rightly, for many businesses, that smaller amount is actually a very large amount for them, and that was going to make a big difference to them too, in the overall context of helping our economy bounce back from the pandemic. Adrian may like to add some more colour into that, if that's okay, Chair.
Yes, please, Mr. Trevitt.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First of all, both of the amounts, they were up to those amounts. So it was either up to 15,000 or up to 70,000. So it wasn't always exactly those amounts. So that enabled potentially smaller businesses to bid in for less than the 15,000. The other thing we did was, when we looked at that, because we knew it was likely to be smaller businesses that were going for the smaller amount, there wasn't quite as much detail required. So if someone was going for the 70,000, then we required a lot more detail. And also, when we were thinking about the fund and how it worked, we knew that there would be far less, and we'd want to award far less 70s than 15s. So we thought the volume was going to come through 15s, and it did. There was a lot more 15s. I think the other thing is that when we were thinking about ARG and the schemes that were there, we were really conscious that there were some elements of the economy that had not had support. And that's really why we created the Exceptional Circumstances Fund. So basically that was trying to address those small companies that hadn't had anything today. What the Bounce Back Challenge Fund was just trying to get, the businesses had really good ideas about how could we bounce back out of this pandemic. And what we wanted to be able to do was give the funding to actually make those things happen. And some, really innovative ideas come through. And some people, they weren't so innovative and were definitely kind of trying it on. So, and we spotted those. So I think we got a good rounded set of applications at that time. And the amounts were kind of fitting in with our budget and how many we were thinking we would be able to encourage through.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to just echo what you'd said at the beginning and say that there was a clearly considerable amount of effort went in, from lots of people on the council, and not least the finance department, in administering these grants, which was over and above what they've been used to, and so I think we need to thank them for that. What I find I'm struggling with some bits of this, I have to say, and one of the bits I've struggled with, and this is not necessarily a local issue, this is a national issue, is that there's an assumption that everybody was suffering. They weren't, all businesses weren't suffering. Actually, some businesses did extremely well out of the pandemic. I know because I act for some of them, and they made a fortune. And so just because somebody applies for a grant doesn't mean they deserve one. And I think Councillor Phipps has already pointed out to a number of instances where, these were very, very rich companies, and we should not have been handing out money to very rich companies that would have easily got through this pandemic. They weren't going to struggle, and so I find it difficult where you've got balance sheets with the size that have been indicated that we were handing money out to. That doesn't seem fair, particularly as Councillor Filer has pointed out. Some smaller businesses, particularly, it was life and death whether they got £10,000, and I also act for a number of those that really struggled. So it's the nature. What I would like to know is how did we challenge that? Where was the challenge in this? You were ticking boxes in terms of, oh yes, they're a company, yes they have a bank account, and yes they do this. But did anybody actually go into their accounts and look at those balance sheets and check that they did deserve it? Do they need it? So that's one thing I wanted to ask about. There was also another challenge which I feel that that I'm not sure you got right, and that was the perception of some loans. How would this be perceived? And again, Councillor Phipps has pointed out one particular example of a company which didn't trade, didn't do anything. It was actually going to it was being given money to put in a planning application to BCP, a planning authority. Now that, from many people's perspectives, including mine, that stinks. That doesn't seem right to me. And so, I think again, where was the challenge that we were giving? And also, that leads me on to the fact that was there any challenge about related parties here? Was there any audit to make sure that nobody on this team or nobody was connected? Because they should have been. It should have been important. That should have been an important aspect that we can't be challenged on that. So and finally, I suppose the last point was, what exact monitoring of the statistics of the grants that we did give? What are we going to find out of all those grants? How many still are in existence? What did they do with that money? How did they spend it? And actually, if they've not really done what they said they were going to do, can we get it back? Because we should be able to do that.
So I think the same format again. Could I go to you, Mr. Shepherd? If there are any details that need to be picked up by Mr. Trevitt, then you'll make us aware of those. Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor. So last point first. and Adrian will put some colour into this, no doubt. But absolutely, as he said in his presentation, we are monitoring those applications, and we do have the right to claw that money back, and we let those people know that is the case. We are receiving those applications, those monitoring reports as we go. We are obviously still in that period of them delivering that process up until, in some cases, up until the end of March. So we will continue to monitor things, and then we will, as Adrian said, put together a summary of all the impacts of those funds, positively, obviously, and where they've impacted in our economy and what they've done for that funding. So it is, rest assured, it is absolutely part of the process, and people knew that when they accepted the award, which also went out as an acceptance letter that they had to sign and approve and agree to. And incidentally, there were things in there around communications where they needed to explain that this was part of the council and the government funding, and adhering to a set of criteria around some of that. So it has been very particularly monitored and will continue to be, and actually is really beneficial. Let's go back to the bigger picture here, to understanding our economy and helping us drive it forward as we come out of the pandemic. So all that information is great for our teams across the council in terms of understanding our economy and what businesses need and what they're doing in our communities or with our communities. In terms of the ethical point, and I'm going to call it that, although I recognise you didn't, about who deserves the money. Let's go back to the point Graham made at the beginning about the pressure we were getting from government to get rid of this money as quickly as possible. Actually, as a result of that, receiving further funding from government, the guidance was clear. The process we went through has been made clear again tonight from Adrian. The process we set out was a competitive process for Bounce Back Challenge Fund. We needed to create this scheme, which we got tested and approved in a number of different places through different authorities, with BEIS, with the consultant, and with our own corporate management board. We clearly advertised the way this was going to work in relation to this scheme. And I come back to the point I made previously. The Bounce Back Challenge was an opportunity for businesses to explore and invent things that would help them bounce back. As Adrian's already articulated, and I have as well, businesses that our focus was on helping those businesses that needed it up until that point. I hope that answers your question, Chair. Maybe Adrian can add some more colour if I've missed anything.
Mr. Trevor?
Thank you. I think one of the key things that we were trying to do was to encourage people to come forward with their ideas to get the funding. And we were really, really keen to have a scoring matrix so they understood what we were looking for in terms of criteria, which we made public. And it was the pride in place, innovation, improving the economy and deliverability. And when the organisations put those suggestions to us, then they were all assessed against the matrix in terms of their score. And when we're talking about some of these bigger applications, then some of them were prepared to put in their own money as well. So they were match fund or more than match fund the money. Those bigger applications were more would deliver more benefits in terms of protecting jobs or creating jobs. So I think the big ones, of which there were less, there's potentially more benefit coming to the local economy through match funding, job numbers, and some real innovative ideas, talking in general. That's not to say that the smaller ones weren't, because there was also a lot of match funding in the smaller ones, and there's some really, really good ideas. But I think in terms of the point, then we had a really, really clear matrix that was publicly available, that everyone knew how it would be scored. And we took into account whether it's a small company, a large company, as we were going through the kind of assessment process and the checking of the Dorset Growth Hub score.
Chair, may I also add a couple of points?
Yes, certainly, Mr. Shepherd. And
Thank you.
I've got one to pick up on in terms of a question that was amongst the questions of Councillor Cox, which I want some specific response to, and then I'll go back to Councillor Cox to see whether he's satisfied.
Okay, Thank you. I just wanted to make the point. I think I didn't answer the question about the checks of staff in relation to any of the applications. And whilst I can absolutely say we didn't proactively check those, I do receive a register of declarations of interest from my staff. And I know, because I know my team well, we only have a few of us, that those declarations, if there are any, were not in any way related to any of these applications. So please rest assured that is covered off. Thank you.
And the point I wanted clarification on from what was asked and what you said, with regard to the follow through about the delivery of what was contained within applications and the work that you would need to undertake to ensure that it had been, and if not, how you would claw that money back. I suspect it's a lot quicker and easier for somebody to apply for funding and to be granted it than it is to have the same incentive at the back end of that process. And I just wonder whether you, for that and any ongoing work, have sufficient resource and able to do it in the timely way that no doubt the government will be demanding. So in other words, there'll be a concentration of work. Have you got the resources to do that and to do it as thoroughly as has been suggested, or would more resource be something that you will be seeking from the council?
May I answer that, Chair? How do I put this delicately? We wouldn't have the extra resource to do this. We would need to, as we have done throughout, manage that within the internal resource we have, and I would include our financial services colleagues in that as well. Whilst we recognise that's a challenge, we very much hope that it won't have to happen through the strength of the due diligence we've done to date. But real life is real life, so we will be very much open to that the situation should it arise. But at the moment, we would be doing that within our existing capacity, as far as I'm aware.
Well, I'll leave that to others who are currently on this call to consider. But the reason I raised the point is that should this committee come back to the governance issues later on in the end phase of the process, what we won't want to hear is that there wasn't sufficient resource and able to do what we thought was due diligence coming out of the process, just as you have done on the way in. I'm sure I've made my point clear. Councillor Cox, would you like to come back?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was a few things. I have to say, Chris, you said an unfortunate thing in one of your answers, and I think you said something like, we asked them to invent things they needed. And that was, I think, an unfortunate expression, and I'll just want to leave that there. But one of the things I did want to make clear at the beginning is there's I think Graham made a very powerful statement about, they were under, BCP were under a lot of pressure to get this through and get this done, get it done quickly. And there didn't seem to be any emphasis on also get it done properly. And those are two quite different pressures. I understand that. I'm an auditor. I get this all the time, getting pressures to sign off a statement. But I think we have to be careful. And there's quite a big distinction here between the treatment that's happened here and the treatment of Mr. Gattrell, for instance. Just to bring in another point from there, you want to get things right in order to do the members' allowances, and sometimes we appreciate the pressures. But sometimes we need to do them right and do them properly. And I'm not entirely sure we got the second part exactly right. Just going back to the statistics which you mentioned, can we make sure that those get published so that we can all see, what kind of record we did have, of what kind of success rate there was, what kind of failure rate we had, and that sort of thing. So that was one question. I thought that was it, please. Thank you.
Mr. Shepherd, would you like to respond, please?
Thank you for pointing out my use of the word invent, Councillor. I think I mean it as it was meant, which was in the creation of activities and situations and projects that will help the company bounce back. As for the publication of the data, yes, absolutely, we will publicise our findings. And as for the point about whether we did things right or quickly, we did things, as far as I'm concerned, we did things right as best as we could with the guidance we had and the governance structures we have. Thank you.
So I wanted to come back on that one, just to say, I do not believe any blame, particularly on that particular point, for the local council. I believe this is the national this is a national failure, as can be evidenced by the fact that a senior peer resigned in the House of Commons because of the lack of process there has been in this whole grant giving way.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. I intentionally don't want to stray into the national issues if we can possibly help it, because I think our remit is very much around the local issues, but I do understand the point you're making. Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just to emphasise the point that actually in talking to colleagues across the country, certainly at the earlier stages of any financial distribution, we were putting in more checks and balances than most other councils. And I just wanted to make that point because I know that both Nigel Stannard and Adam Richards were very clear that, I think to quote Councillor Cox, actually, we had to do it right. And we wanted to make sure we had the right controls in place. So my sense is that we've always led any funding process with the right controls to get it right, even when that's meant we've had to push back into government about distribution pace because we felt we had the process right. Just wanted to remake that point, really.
Thank you, Chief Executive. And I may come back to Mr. Stannard at the end of this meeting, just perhaps to emphasise how he sees it from an internal audit position. I think that would be a right and proper thing for us to do as the committee. Councillor Rice.
Thank you. I happy to emphasise all of the points that have been made by everybody else in terms of thank you for the work that's done, and I probably can't imagine how busy you were. The point I wanted to make, well, first of all, actually, I would also like to state that I am on a small steering group that has received about £9,000 in the Bounce Back Fund, but I received no payment for my work. The point I want to raise is around the climate emergency. So the council has obviously declared a climate and ecological emergency, and the government has also declared emergencies. And in order to reach zero carbon by 2050, every sector within our area needs to start reducing their carbon footprint now. It doesn't work to continue having a high level of carbon footprint and then suddenly drop it. The expectation is everybody has to start dropping now to stand any chance. At the moment, I've just learned today that as a planet, we're on track for probably most people know this, about a 2-degree rise in temperature, but actually that's an average over the planet. And in the land areas, we're talking about a 7-degree rise over our land areas, which you can imagine is, well, it's much more significant than you can sort of imagine. In practical terms, we currently have 1% of the world land is inhabitable, such as the Saharan Desert. Now, with that 2 degrees global rise, that means that 20% of land becomes like the Saharan Desert. So my question around this is, what every business does locally is very important. There is no other way of tackling climate change. Everyone has to tackle it together, and we need to support each other to do so. I think it would have been appropriate to have included some criteria within the Bounce Back Fund for, at the very minimum, asking about what are they doing about their carbon footprint, but ideally having some points awarded to businesses that were specifically going over and above in terms of reducing their carbon footprint. So to summarise, I wonder, do you think this is a rational comment from myself? And secondly, maybe we could have an ongoing discussion about what we do going forwards in terms of future funding allocations.
I think, Mr. Shepherd, I'll just ask you to respond to Councillor Rice, if I may.
Of course, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Rice. Yes, it's perfectly rational. Thank you. Thank you for asking the question. You know, we're in a climate emergency, and what you state is now is at the forefront of our minds, as always. And this is why we put it as a fundamental pillar in our economic development strategy as part of our pledge. We're asking businesses to sign up to alongside others. I think you have a point. we may well we could have considered that as part of our bounce back challenge fund, but we didn't at the time. Our focus was very much on encouraging businesses to do what they can to invest in their future growth. But you're right, that could have been with with carbon neutrality in mind. But we are actively working with our colleagues across the council to see ways we can help businesses with this challenge. As I said, it's part of the pledge. And would like to work with you on any future funding we get as to how that might happen. But we are now hopefully reaching the end of any allocations from government around this. However, as I'm sure all councils have been aware, the levelling up agenda has now been white paper has now been released, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities in there to bid for some funds and help businesses bid for those funds to become carbon neutral and help us with this climate emergency. So I hope that's sufficient, Chair.
I think that's a very straightforward response to you, Councillor Rice, and a very positive one, if I may say so. Vice Chairman.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations on bringing home what's a really difficult job. I think you recognised halfway through that not everything is right. It couldn't possibly be with such a large amount of money. What lessons do you think you've learned, and how will you apply them in the future?
I think that's another one for you, Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you. I'm loving these hot potatoes tonight, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Williams. What lessons have we learned? Wow. Maybe this is a flippant remark, but maybe we could clone the economic development team and the finance services team. That would be a great start. So we've got some more resources to deal with the wave of activity that Adam explained earlier. But seriously though, in lessons learned, clearly there were a few things we could have done differently. Particularly the question I've just answered, for example. It's a really difficult question because I'm convinced we did it right, and we did, and as Graham just rightly pointed out, that we had the checks and balances in the system. But there are probably things we could do again that we might do differently if we had the chance again. Perhaps to save us this kind of scrutiny, because even though I believe we've done it right, and this is the right and proper forum to do that, I understand why you want to have this conversation, but maybe there are some specifics that Adrian would think about because he's been close to the process. But that's all I want to say, really. I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. Mr. Trevor, did you want to add to that?
It's difficult to say what we would do a lot different because the situation was always changing. And apart from the comments that Chris made about resources and maybe doing things, perhaps we could have slowed things down a bit, but then I don't think it would have achieved what we're trying to. So no, I'm not going to add anything to what Chris said.
Mr. Richards.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think what I'd emphasise is maybe some of the points that I made earlier in my remarks, in the sense that one of the lessons learned for me is that conversation with government, so that they better understand the work of the council's revenue and benefits team and economic development teams, so they have a better appreciation that, for example, today's announcements, just as we're about to start to go to print around council tax bills, for example, and they might need additional wording on them, is not particularly helpful. So it's that trying to get government to understand the workings of the local authority and the working of these teams more than they currently do, I think is a lesson for all of us to try and work through in the future. I think there's that emphasis on the government around the pitfalls that discretionary schemes bring in these kind of scenarios, because I think, as we've reiterated time and time again tonight, with discretionary schemes, lines have to be drawn, and if local authorities in different areas are drawing the lines in different places, that causes confusions to many of our businesses that operate on a national or a regional basis. They're not going to understand why in one area they can get a grant and in another area they can't get a grant, and that isn't helpful for anybody with regards to that overall process. And then I think it's that almost reflection with government around that we know that the need to get money out quickly, but there has to be, from a good governance and audit process, there has to be sufficient time for those checks and balances, to be in place. Which clearly this local council we took that extra time to put those checks and balances, and sometimes that was a frustration of our local economy because the grants weren't getting out. Maybe as comparable to some of those local authorities that didn't take that time to get that extra level of governance in place. So I think there's a lot of reflection for everybody, particularly with regards to, I think, that national understanding of the local environment, and making sure that from a national perspective they allow that sufficiency to make things sure that we get things right, not rushed.
Well, thank you for those comments, Mr. Richards, and I'd certainly encourage this council at the highest level to be making those recommendations very strongly through the Local Government Association, rather than hoping that by leaving it to others it might happen. I think there's an opportunity here from the officers have made tonight that those lessons learned should be fed back to government via the LGA. And that we should be trying to encourage that across the organisation, because the announcements today won't have made your task any easier at all, and it's to be regretted that it's been brought out in such haste. In terms of further questions, there are a number of members of the committee who have indicated they'd like to come back again, and I know there are a couple of questions waiting from those who are not on the committee. Could I please just encourage you to focus on the governance issues? It's almost impossible, I know, not to stray, if you like, into overview and scrutiny territory, because the two are so very, very closely linked on these issues. But if we could try to focus on the governance issues, I'm conscious of time, but I also want to make sure that everybody's had their say as well. So with that very much in mind, in the order they've indicated, I'll go back to Councillor Filer.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'll not ask the question because I think it's not governance, it's more lessons learned. So in the interest of time, I'll leave this one.
Thank you. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. It's really to try and just dig just a little bit deeper on the issue that Councillor Phipps raised, and I think an answer from Mr. Trevitt to Councillor Cox over the way in which the criteria were applied and the scoring, which to me is part of the process and part of the governance elements. And from my previous experiences in schools dealing with assessment matrices, I have a pretty good grasp of how they work. And when you're scoring within those matrices, yes, there will be a little bit of variation between people who are interpreting the points within the matrix, and they might score slightly differently. But the answer Mr. Trevitt gave said that all the clients who had applied would know, having received the matrix and all the criteria within, would know exactly what was wanted by the council. Earlier on, we heard that the hub had done the initial assessments, and then Mr. Shepherd and his assistant re-looked at some of these, and there appears to be, and I know there'll be very few in number, but there appeared to be one or two very significant changes in the scoring, which I would have expected from the way we've understood and been told about the criteria could not possibly have happened at the scale of change that was indicated or scored. So can you actually explain in a little bit more detail how that review, if you like, from the first stage to the second stage took place, and why it is that there could have been such significant changes in the scoring of some of those criteria? I don't know what your numbering was for each column and each row, but if something went up from 0 to 5, and 5 was your maximum, that is a tremendous jump and change, and changes the whole element of, do we give a grant or don't we give a grant? So that to me is a very, very critical part of the process, and how it is managed is all part of the governance.
And I think Councillor Brooke raises an important point which I and perhaps other members of the committee are not entirely clear about from the presentation this evening. That's not a failing, it's just one that we want to come back on. So if I could ask you, Mr. Shepherd, to try and address that head on, please, to give us a much clearer idea of how that part of the process worked.
Well, Chair, as the overall decision maker, I was receiving advice from my team, so I might just pass that particular question to Mr. Trevor, if that's okay with yourself.
That's fine. I don't know if there isn't a fulsome enough answer for Councillor Brooke, he may want to come back and ask you personally as well.
Of
so
course.
Mr. Trevor.
You're on mute, Adrian.
I was getting so engrossed listening that I forgot to take my mute off. Sorry. It's a difficult one to answer. When the Growth Hub have been through their scoring, then on the side of the spreadsheet, they would give a reason and some kind of background to why they said what they've said. And I think on a like I say, the numbers are really, really small, but on some of them we didn't agree with them. But what we did to make sure that we weren't kind of we haven't got the grasp of we weren't grasping the idea right, was that we talked about each of the projects that had a change in project score, whether it was small or large, at the award panel, and we said what our reasons were as to why that score was changing. Then we had a debate about the application, and we would agree what the scoring was. So I can't explain those big gaps, but what I can say is where we did have a big gap, then it was actually discussed at the award panel and subsequently either agreed or not agreed.
Yeah, fine. If I may just come back briefly. What I can't understand is if the assessment criteria were as clearly defined as they were, how two people could come to such opposing conclusions or interpretations of that particular criteria or those particular criteria, which is what you're actually saying, that an explanation was given, you disagreed with it. Well, surely your criteria would have ruled that potential disagreement out in the first place. Otherwise, your criteria are not sufficiently clear and therefore open to a much wider range of interpretations, and therefore more mistakes could have been made all the way down the line. But you're not aware of them. Sorry, I'm being very, very critical here, but I'm really trying to get to the bottom of how some of these really big changes in the scores could have happened and how there could have been such a wide disagreement over one or two particular criteria.
I accept Councillor Brooke. It's an important point for us to understand and get clear. Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to explain the difference between the Growth Hub and the council officers. Yeah, the Growth Hub works with businesses day in, day out in the local economy, but on their business successes and their business planning. At the micro level with them to help them grow. They don't have a wider strategic geographic knowledge of the economy like our economic development team does. And therefore, whether it be in the case you're alluding to or other cases, and of literally the handful that there were that Adrian has said, there could be those discrepancies because there are such big gaps in knowledge around the strategic picture of some of those applications. And the particular case in point was the one you're talking about. That is the case in point. So you know, ultimately, I think we agree, don't we, that we want our professional officers to use their professional judgment and their professional knowledge and expertise about the wider economy and the geographic situation that we are in, and their knowledge of what's happening, to ultimately make the recommendation to me to make that decision, even though our independent assessor in the beginning had scored it in a way they had scored it through their lens. Regardless of the criteria, in that sense, in that they used the criteria, they looked at it through their lens and made a judgment call on it based on what they knew. It's not fair, I think, to necessarily ask them to know the entire economy background, but what we needed was both a capacity and an independent view at initial assessment stage to give us a score from which to look at and review.
I'll not take it further other than to say that clearly there was a very subjective element creeping into something which should have been objective, and leave it at that.
Thank you. I've had an indication from one person who's not on the committee who I want to go to without keeping them waiting for too long. I want to come to Mr. Stannard, but I also want to come back to Councillor Phipps. And I think probably the right order to do this is to go to the member not on the committee, then to come back to Councillor Phipps, and then I want to go to Mr. Stannard after that, and indeed any other officers who wish to wrap up particular issues at the end of this presentation. So without further ado, and thank you for being so patient, Councillor Farquhar. Sorry you've had to wait so long, but it's the normal process to go through the committee first and then come to those who are not. So Councillor Farquhar, you have a question or two. Please go ahead.
Absolutely, Chair, and my thanks to yourself and the Vice Chair for allowing me to hopefully add something to the contribution. If I sound a bit husky, it's because I've got the lurgy at the moment, and I do apologise. If I speak too quickly, it's because I'm trying to get it out. I'm conscious of the time. I found it fascinating to be a part of this discussion and debate, particularly the pressures that have been put upon the local authority and the teams which are dealing with the distribution of these grants. And I would heartily recommend that those teams are recognised and is publicised the successes that the local authority has in distributing the money. And it makes me a little bit sad as an elected member that those pressures were put upon the local authority and those officers to actually, and conflicting day by day. As a member of the public, I think we all experience that on guidance, on a variety of bits and pieces, that we didn't know at some points what was happening from one day to the next, whether or not the school will be open on a Monday, or if it was open on a Monday, it'd be closed on the Wednesday. So I can certainly sympathise with the pressures, and I'm very pleased that the director responsible for the teams brought out the pressures and the CEOs actually on the everyday people that are doing this job of work, learning the same as everybody else was to work from home and deliver these services. There's one thing which I did stand out in my mind on that particular subject, if I may, Chair, and it does follow through a little bit, is to my questions, the nature of why I'm asking them, is because it's changed so very often. I heard that the tens of thousands of grants which have been processed, the millions of pounds which have been that have been distributed throughout the ARG schemes, and we are very much focused on the bounce back scheme. Perhaps part of the problem is the terminology used. Perhaps it gives a degree of misunderstanding to the term discretion as opposed to criteria which you need to fulfill, and that colours my questions. The particular point there is that the up to 15,000 and up to 70,000 is the reason why one of the residents has approached me, who is a sole trader. That £15,000, and for those that had the good fortune to be in a company where you weren't self-employed, to be furloughed, etc., those individuals have not struggled quite so much as perhaps other individuals such as sole traders and the self-employed across a variety of jobs, including my own as a film extra. But my questions are geared around not the specific case, but the recognition that up to £15,000 is something for an individual sole trader, which I'm focused on in this one. And Chair, if I stray into outside of the governance, please adjust my questions, and I've got 5 because some have been answered already. Please adjust it appropriately, and I'll call upon you, Chair, to do that. So if I can crack on, question 1. For the Bounce Back Fund, was there any criteria that eliminated an applicant that had received a grant from elsewhere in the ARG streams? So that's my first question. And so, in other words, had that individual, that sole trader, received a grant somewhere else, would they have been eliminated from the Bounce Back Fund? If the answer is no, is there a way that we can actually backtrack the awards that were actually given out and those that were not awarded to indicate how much of the oversubscription, because I think it was 2/3 oversubscribed looking at the numbers, would have been reduced to a manageable level to actually fulfill the budget, which was of 3 million, as opposed to the budget, which would have been 11 million. Everybody got an award. So question 2, I've heard repeatedly a small percentage of those 320 applicants for the Bounce Back Fund, of which 109 were awarded. What is the actual number whereby those figures were actually changed? And is that actual number changed from what the Business Support Hub, and good work for the Business Support Hub to try and whittle those numbers down to a manageable number? What is the actual number that were actually changed either up or down from what the Business Support Hub had actually recommended? And my follow-up and my additional question, perhaps a follow-up question, how many single traders of that 109, and indeed of all the applicants, the 320 applicants, were single traders? So that's a question which I would be interested in learning, Chair. Question 3.
Councillor Farquhar, do you think I could ask you to speed up just a little bit? I don't think that last one really is a matter for us in terms of governance.
Understood.
It's a matter of interest, but does it actually relate to the governance employed by the officers in dispensing these grants? I think that's really where we're focused.
Thank you, Chair. I really appreciate that. And if you could guide me on question 3 then, or we'll eliminate question 2. I heard that the understanding would be that they would look at how the awards were spent up to 70,000, but I didn't hear the recommendation that the same diligence would be looked at those that were awarded up to 15,000 during the back and forth of the discussion. If that was part of the governance, Chair. Question 4. I'm very interested in the BIS audit, and I'm very interested in the replies which came back as regards what diligence will be done in actually clawing that money back. Particularly since, and again, we're straying off the point, is that the direction from government is that 4.3 billion is actually being written off over the grants schemes and so on and so forth. And I know a very, very small percentage of that will be down to the Bounce Back Fund administrated by BCP. But again, that award of up to 15,000 to a sole trader is very, very important. And question 6 again, and I think this is for governance, is that in answer to Councillor Filer's question of the makeup of the panel or the board to look at the scores that came forward, Councillor Broadhead was listed as a consultee. I don't know what the term consultee actually means, or what involvement that the member Councillor Broadhead actually have had in the assessment of those, or the influence they had on the changing of those scores. So that may well be a governance question, Chair, but I'll leave it up to you. And if I may, just one last one, Chair. And it follows on the backside of Councillor Brooks' question for the DGH and what the change of the scores was, is that it was commented that the DGH made notes as regards why they awarded each score. So my question is, did the panel that changed those scores, did they also make notes? And if those notes are actually open to audit at this later date? So that's my questions, and I'd appreciate if you could filter through those, Chair, to say which ones are valid for this committee.
Well, thank you very much indeed. What I will do is I will ask Mr. Shepherd, together with Mr. Trevitt, to answer as best they can the specifics of what you've asked in terms of governance and governance alone. So, Mr. Shepherd.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Farquhar. I believe I'm correct in saying, but Adrian will nod if I or shake his head if I'm not, that in answer to your first question, there wasn't a situation where an applicant who had received grants already couldn't then apply for the Bounce Back Challenge Fund. So I believe it was open to everybody, and there was no restrictions on it from that perspective. Is there any way we can look at the awards that were awarded and been reduced to a manageable budget? It will take a lot of officer time when we're currently dealing with Omicron grants and trying to get those out the door. I do sort of fail to see the purpose, but I'm sure if the committee wishes it to be so, then I'm sure we can action that should we need to as part of our ongoing monitoring of this. The question of the actual number of changes, I will let Adrian confirm that, but I think he said there were 5 earlier, but I'll double check. But he can come back and check on that. The diligence around monitoring, the due diligence around monitoring for the 15 and the 70, I think we did touch on that earlier. There is a slightly reduced requirement on those people with 15,000 than those on 70, or to put it another way, those with the big amounts of having to be a lot more scrutinised and monitored. So whichever way around you want on that, but yes, there is diligence on them. I didn't quite catch your question about amounts written off and the relationship to loans, but I think that's not necessarily relevant for this committee and this question, but that's up for others to decide. But as far as I'm concerned, we're working with the balance we've got, and we're intending to allocate that fully. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the answer to your question. Councillor Broadhead's role as a consultee, I think this has been addressed already, but the delegation in the decision record that was passed by Corporate Management Board or Corporate Incident Management Board, I think it was at the time, was about delegating me the powers, and in consultation with the portfolio holder, I believe. But again, would need to check that, but for certain. But there was no undue influence. It was about being part of that the group that we talked about. Assessing and reviewing and debating the applications for me to make the final decision. And notes from officers, I will leave that to perhaps Mr. Stannard to say about whether I believe we've shared all the notes we've got with our internal auditors as per the request. And as you'll have seen, we've had the audit done, as Adrian mentioned earlier. We've shared everything we can possibly share. And indeed, I would go so far as to say that with your constituent, we have shared everything we can possibly share, and he has been informed of that matter. So I think that probably answers my answers, Chair. But back to you.
Thank you. You raised one point Mr. Stannard might want to comment on. I'm going to come back to Mr. Stannard at the end of the meeting, but on that one issue, Mr. Stannard, could you just respond, please?
Thank you, Chair. It covers off other issues, actually. So you'll recall in the audit report that has been circulated to the committee, the most significant recommendation is around the issue that Chris has just raised there. That one of our suggestions for improvement is that if we were doing a similar scheme in future, we would suggest to the teams, any team doing it, that where scores are changed from one gateway to another, that is clearly documented. So, perceptions of, what's being said tonight can be very clearly articulated. It's recorded at the time of those discussions. What Chris's team provided us in our audit were other methods of demonstrating that, so email discussions, for example, and what we're saying is a single document on, for example, adding to the spreadsheet that the Dorset Growth Hub, another cell to the right of that saying why that cell had been, why that score had been adjusted. Perfect. So that was the key recommendation really coming out of our audit.
Thank you very much. Mr. Trevitt, did you have anything you wanted to add to what Mr. Shepherd just said in response to Councillor Farquhar's questions?
You're on mute again.
I should have come there and wouldn't have been on mute there 3 times. Just a couple of very quick things. I think when we look at the numbers that were actually changed, I think the percentage was something like 5 or 6%. So it was probably about 25 out of the 321. And then just to build on something that Chris said, in terms of the 15 and 70,000 and what checks were done, all the checks that were required by government were done on both. It's just the additional elements for the 70,000 that we put on top. So the ongoing monitoring is more rigorous on the 70,000 than the 15,000. So, but all the necessary checks were done that were required by government, so NFI, etc. And I think, it's really important that, we wanted to give this money out to businesses and we want them to use it and to do what they said they would do. We don't want it clawed back by Bays. We don't want, things like that to happen. And that's why right back at the beginning, we've been talking to this ACS consultant who's, looking after 250 local authorities. And we're trying to make sure that the schemes that we do all the way through to from approval to actually doing the project to actually making things happen is all following government guidance, so that there's no cause for any issues or concern from Bays when they come and do their audit. That was it, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Trevitt. Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up on a point in regards to Councillor Farquhar's questioning, because I think in that reference was made to £4.9 million or £4.9 billion, which is the estimated fraud from various government schemes. To be clear, that £4.9 billion is a specific reference to the COVID loan schemes to businesses that were put in place by government and administered by the banks, not any reference to the grants that was administered by local authorities.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your questions, Councillor Parker. I hope you found the answers useful to you. The other member who isn't a member of the committee who has indicated he has a question is Councillor Trent. Councillor Trent.
Thank you, Chair. I think first of all, I'll just offer a quick comment, a cross between a question and a comment, is that if you're not there in the first place, how can you define bouncing back? But that's an aside line. The point I wanted to ask, and because I've been very aware of examples where some, and this is probably as much to do with ARG1 than it is the bounce back scheme, is that if you've got a charity that is providing a service, a welfare service, and it has contracts to fulfil, and it is unable to fulfil everything that it's supposed to do, and bear in mind this is providing a welfare service, and it needs to get additional qualifications so it can deliver the rest of the service. Is that a charity? Is it a business? At what point does it become something that would have fitted into ARG1? And if there is a clarification of the definition, can that be shared? Because I'm pretty certain that this isn't the last COVID type event we're ever going to have. I think where it's happened in the Far East and so on, it's become something that's every few years. It might be 10 years between instances, but it seems we've moved into that world. And so we perhaps need to look at those definitions. So I don't know if anyone can help me in where this fine line is between a charity and a business, and the charity is actually creating service and working to contracts. Although it's a charity and not a commercial business, I just kind of seek a bit of guidance on that.
Thank you. I think what I'll do is I'll ask Mr. Trevett to respond in terms of what governance he and his team used to make that determination. Mr. Trevett.
Thank you. I'm definitely off mute. We in economic development didn't administer ARG1, so I think what we'd have to do is double check that for you. But what I can say is that in ARG3, then charities were certainly allowed to bid, and indeed the Community Action Network received grants through our business support activities to the tune, I think it is about 50,000. So we were granting to charities.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trevett. Councillor Trent, does that answer your question?
Well, it sort of does, but hopefully, if I if I can share a copy, or someone else can share a copy of the definitions you've got. But I do think that we need to have a much clearer guideline as to what is what, because as I say, the particular organisation I've got in my mind did receive help, but from a very inappropriate place, and I felt it should have received help from something directly related to COVID. And so it would be very helpful to me if something like that happened again, or to any other councillor who has something that operates in their area that they'll come into contact with that needs help. I think we need clarity on it anyway. That is basically what I want is clarity in the event of something happening in the future where, you kind of find, well, actually, you should be going elsewhere, sort of thing.
I think Mr. Trevett has volunteered that he will, to the best of his ability and knowledge, convey that back to you. I don't know how long it will take him to do, but I'm sure he'll do it. Thank you very much. So, as I suggested earlier, I'll come back to Councillor Phipps, who's now heard all the other questions, to see what else you think has been left unsaid around the governance issues that you would like to get Mr. Shepherd or Mr. Trevett to respond to. Councillor Phipps.
Okay, well, yeah, some of the things I was going to mention have already been mentioned, so I'd perhaps like just comment on a couple of things and ask a few things as well. So one of them is been mentioned is the panel. That's already been brought up, and I have to say that some of the answers that have been given are a little at odds to what I was actually told in writing when I asked who was on the panel. And I was basically told there were two people on the panel, which was yourself, Mr. Shepherd, and Councillor Broadhead. That was it. It was just the two of you. I've got that in writing. That's what I was told. But now we're told it was yourself, supported by officers, but the councillor was only a consultee. Well, I had no idea about that, so that's what we're being told at the moment. It's basically at odds with what I was originally told, and I just wanted to make that comment because I think that the composition of the panel actually is quite important as far as the governance of this whole scheme is concerned. And I think whether there should be more councillors or less councillors, or perhaps some more independent people, I don't know. But I think it's something that perhaps should be thought about. Hopefully we won't get into the situation again. But that was my comment on the panel. I was also going to talk about, and I still just like a bit more clarification on this, the records that have been kept, because this has been broached upon, and I'm not sure I totally understood what these records are. So the Dorset Growth Hub appraised each proposal, and presumably there are records that show what they said and what they scored. They must be those because they were sent to you, okay, to look at. Then, what records have you got specifically that then show what you thought about each issue, each application? Did you comment on ones where you agreed, as well as those that were changed? Have you got specific records that show what your economic development team said on that? That's it, because I think there's got to be a clear audit trail. There has to be, otherwise this isn't right at all. Councillor Cox has already mentioned about the checks, and you've said that they will be followed through for checks on each one. I'm presuming there'll be records kept on that as well. Right, but I just want to be clear that we do have records from Dorset Growth Hub and from your team. That's what I want to be clear on. So that there is an audit trail. Okay, so that's that. And this really does now come down to a question, because I'm still not 100% clear on this, because in section 32 of the government guidance, there's exclusions to ARG funding. And one of them states that ARG funding should not be used for capital projects that do not provide direct business support. And as far as I'm aware, I'll just come back to this because it's my final go at it, ARG funding was provided to help trading businesses impacted by COVID. So it's already been mentioned that with this decision for the one that, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't exist in the location where the money was given, was a subjective decision. And I still fail to see how submitting a few reports towards stage 1 planning and not even putting in a planning application for actually quite a controversial scheme actually achieves assisting a business that was impacted by COVID. It doesn't. All it seems to me to have done is to assist a planning consultant by paying him for some reports. So I still don't get that one. I don't know whether you can actually explain it to me, but it just doesn't seem right. And I don't see how it complies with actual government ARG funding criteria. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Phipps. Well, I'll revert to Mr. Shepherd and Mr. Trevitt. I think, Mr. Shepherd, if you could perhaps deal with the first two of those, and probably Mr. Trevitt the third one, that would be helpful, please.
Sure, Chair, no problem. The short answers are yes, we have records, which I believe we may have shared with Councillor Phipps, but even so, even if we haven't, we have those records, absolutely. And yes, we are doing checks, as we've already discussed today, and yes, there'll be records of those kept. That's my answers, Chair.
Is that fully covering the first two of your questions, Councillor Phipps?
Yeah, that covered the records. I only made a comment on the panel, but I still don't understand how this, as I just mentioned, this final one meets the criteria of direct support to an impacted business.
I'm going to come back to that one, Mr. Trevitt. So, Mr.
Yeah,
Shepherd,
especially as
could you perhaps just address the panel part of it, please, because that's the bit that Councillor Phipps raised in the first instance. Just for total clarity, regardless of what's been in emails or said previously, just to be very clear about who was actually appointed onto the panel and who was actually a consultee. So I just want to make sure that we are all talking about exactly the same thing.
Absolutely. Yep. No, as I said before, I was the decision maker. I had the delegated authority in consultation with Councillor Broadhead as the portfolio holder. He was there as a consultee, and my team were there as the advisors and the ones doing the work, looking at it, as I've said before, in the context of the wider economy and their professional knowledge. Hopefully that clears it up.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Trevitt, the third point, please.
Yeah, I know this is a specific case, but I'll just go back. We looked at the criteria and basically marked it on the application that was there. So, yeah, I think without going back and looking at the detail of the specific application, then yeah, I'm confident that the criteria would have been met. Also, the NFI checks would have been done on the actual applicant. So I think that's my answer, Chris. Sorry,
Would it be
Chair.
okay to come in, Chair?
If you've got something to add, Mr. Shepherd, certainly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this has also got to be taken in the context, as we've explained again and again tonight, that the bounce back challenge was after all the other businesses had been given awards through the other schemes that we've identified. So Councillor Phipps is right to point out the guidance, and she's right to point out the fact that this was about businesses recovering from COVID. However, we felt that we had achieved that through the other funds that have been identified. Bounce Back Challenge was about bouncing back from the pandemic, and therefore we set out the criteria that we did. It was not that it wasn't in line with government guidance. It was still supporting businesses bouncing back from the pandemic. They needed to justify under that criteria. So that is why we took that decision to create that part of the scheme alongside all the other schemes we created. Thank you.
Well, my suggestion is, because this is a specific, and I've made it clear throughout, we don't want to get involved in specific cases. But what I would suggest is this could be taken up between either Mr. Trevor or Mr. Shepherd with Councillor Phipps. I'm perfectly happy to be copied in on that correspondence if you want some sort of independent view on it. But I don't want to get into the specifics of an individual case.
I understand that, and I have been in correspondence, and I would like to have more correspondence, and I will copy you in. Thank you very much for that. I do disagree with you on this one, as you probably gathered, and there were others that were refused grants that I believe could have benefited from that, but I won't continue it now. Thank you very much.
Well, please, if you could do as I've suggested, I think that's really the right way forward for us for this evening. I said I'd come back to hearing from Mr. Stannard from the internal audit position. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Really only want to add a couple of things, if I may. First thing I've alluded to before, I have circulated the audit report that my team did on the ARG. If any councillors of the committee, having heard the context tonight and reread that and have any further issues, then please reach out to me and I'll happily respond to those offline. And then I just wanted to really cover a little bit of what Chief Exec said earlier and a response to Councillor Cox's query about our due diligence and going over and above the government's expectations in some of these grant areas. And I think it's best illustrated at the very early part of the pandemic. And I think you'll recall as a committee, I reported that for 6 weeks of the early part of the pandemic, the whole of the internal audit team was re-tasked with providing due diligence to these early grants that came out before the government had its NFI toolkits up to date, before it had Spotlight up to date. So we were manually checking every single grant application that came in. Did the bank account details match the company, for example? And we prevented, again, I'm repeating what you've already been told over the period, but three grants, fraud or error, could have been either, where the bank account that was being submitted by the company did not match the company bank account. It was either the individuals that owned the company, and that was prevented. So the company was paid the grant. So I'm trying to illustrate the over and above efforts that we did as a council, and the chief executive was getting, as he explained earlier, messages from government saying you're not rolling this out quick enough. We were confident that we were doing the due diligence in the background to make sure these grants were going to people who needed it and met the criteria. So that's why we were confident we were on firm ground to hold our ground and do things properly.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Stannard. I left you to the last, and I know you've probably been frustrated by that, but you are our key link officer for this committee, and the management assurance part of it, I think, is absolutely critical to members of the committee to get that directly from you, from an internal audit perspective, and so I find that helpful and reassuring. Although I do appreciate that some members of the committee perhaps are still frustrated by certain elements of this or these schemes. We've done our very best, I think, this evening to explore those issues, and I think that we could give this a go for another 2.5 hours probably if we have the will to do so this evening. I doubt that we have, but I would like to say a big thank you to the officers for their time and their input and their effort in bringing this issue to us here at Audit and Governance, to give it a proper looking at in governance terms. And so, Mr. Shepherd, Mr. Trevitt, thank you very much indeed for that, and for the input of Mr. Richings and the Chief Executive. All of that's been immensely helpful. There are one or two issues running out of this evening which need follow through, and I would be surprised if certain members of the committee don't add to those in terms of communicating directly with you if those issues if they feel any of those issues remain unresolved. And I'd ask you please to respond to those in a timely way if at all possible. But I think the spirit of the committee has been very much about understanding how this operated and to be satisfied that the governance arrangements were robust enough to satisfy the remit of the committee. So if there are any follow-throughs, please feel free, members, to do so. I would appreciate if I and the Vice Chairman could be copied on those, really for completeness if nothing else, and indeed on the responses from the officers as well, of course. And so if there is anything to follow through directly with members of the committee, we would then be in a position to do so. So thank you all very much indeed for your input this evening. It's been appreciated. We look forward to receiving those slides, please, Mr. Trevitt, in the way that we discussed earlier. We can then look at those and contextualise what it is we've discussed this evening. Thank you for that. Members, just before we break at the end of the committee, I just wanted a very quick word about the forward plan and two specific issues on it. One is that you will have been circulated yesterday or the day before regarding the date for one of the additional meetings we were looking for, which will be on Thursday the 10th of March. And that additional issue was a one-item agenda again, which was just for us to look at the governance arrangements around future places and the Urban Regeneration Company. As you remember, I was very keen that we got to see this. I apologise that we're crowding ourselves a little bit with meetings. However, the timing of this is absolutely critical, and we need to be looking at those governance arrangements at the earliest opportunity. A, for officers to have the work prepared, but B, before it is, if you like, after the event. We mustn't allow that to happen. So that's going to happen on the 10th of March. And then, of course, as you will know, we have a further additional meeting the following Thursday, the 17th of March, looking at statement of accounts and a number of other issues. There is, in addition to what you have in the forward plan, though, one other item which we will need to find time for. And again, it's going to need to be in a timely way, and that's over the overview and scrutiny arrangements, which we've been instructed by the last full council meeting to bring back to audit and governance. I'm hopeful that we'll manage to get a time that is suitable in terms of getting the right input into it, but is early enough that we're able to bring those arrangements in place for the new municipal year. And just to leave you with a thought about this, I hope I made it clear previously that although we're not going to go to the governance working group, we're going to come straight to the main committee. I'm very keen that we do so in a way that is going to bring all the parties together to have their input to this committee. What I would like to try and avoid, it may be premature and naive, but I'd like to try and avoid happening, is that we do it in audit and governance, and then we do it in full council and find that all of our work has been undone. That I do not want to happen, because I think all members find that extremely frustrating. And if you could apply your minds individually and collectively to how we might best achieve what we're trying to, by bringing into the room all of those interested parties, it would be appreciated. I'm asking officers to do some background research, have conversations with others, and to make sure that we have something which is likely to end up with a workable solution, but not one that then looks as though it's imposition rather than collective thought. A difficult one, and time is against us, but we'll come back to the committee with some dates for that as soon as we possibly can. So, members, thank you very much indeed for your time this evening. Thank you to members who are not here or members of the public who are still with us, and thank you to the officers. And I close the meeting at 8:32. Thank you all very much.